Greetings, everyone. I'm Lee Showquist, the Marketing Director here at Campbell & Company. Welcome to today's webinar, First Look, Giving USA 2016, the latest trends in giving. Today's June 15th, and we're broadcasting live from Chicago, Seattle, and around the country, so thanks so much for joining us. Before we begin today, I'd like to go over a few basic logistics. Close any programs other than GoToWebinar, of course, that might be running on your computer right now. Call in, if possible, using a telephone instead of using your computer speakers. You might want to move your cell phone away from the computer as well. And if you experience any visual issues, send a chat in the chat pane there to Campbell & Company, or contact GoTo at 800-263-6317. Today's webinar will last about 90 minutes. For your participation today, you're going to earn one continuing education credit with CFRE International. Later today, you can expect to receive an email from GoToWebinar that includes information on how to download your certificate, as well as a PDF of today's presentation. The webinar is also being recorded, so you will also receive a link to today's recording. We welcome your questions throughout the webinar, so please go ahead and type them into the GoToWebinar control panel there on the right-hand side of your screen. If we can work them in during the course of today's conversation, we'll do so, but we'll also hold some time at the end of the discussion for a little bit of Q&A. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. Leading today's program is Campbell & Company President and Chief Executive Officer Peter Fissinger, and moderating the panel discussion will be Kate Roosevelt, Executive Vice President of Collins Group, a division of Campbell & Company. Our panelists today include Diana Aviv, Chief Executive Officer, Feeding America; Steve Churchill, President and Chief Executive Officer of AHP, the Association for Healthcare Philanthropy; and Sue Cunningham, President of Council for Advancement and Support of Education, commonly known as CASE. Now I'd like to turn this over to Peter, and we'll get started.
Thank you very much, Lee, and I'd like to add my welcome to everybody who's joined us today, and thank my colleague Kate Roosevelt, as well as our panelists who are going to really make this a terrific event. I'm going to present an overview of the data that was released yesterday by Giving USA. I expect this overview to take about 25 minutes, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kate Roosevelt, who's going to engage with our panelists on a wide-ranging discussion regarding philanthropy. So if you look at the slide that shows right now, that's the cover of the Giving USA 2016 book. Part of the reason that we're showing this to you is we hope that you may decide at the end of this presentation that the data is valuable enough that you would purchase some form of it through the Giving USA Foundation. You'll receive a 30% discount through Campbell & Company if you do choose to make a purchase, and we'll show you a code that you can use. We hope you may find the information to be useful working with your boards or volunteers or staff, and please know that whatever you do in terms of a purchase of the materials will help fund next year's research. So let's just get right to it and talk about Giving USA and what it actually is. This aggregates two contributions made in 2015 by source and recipient type, and we're going to focus on rates of change both in last year and the last 2 years by source and recipient type. We're going to acknowledge some trends in total giving and spend some time on the economic trends in the country and how they affect giving. We're going to look at giving by source, recipient type, trends in volunteering, and trends in the number of nonprofit organizations in this country. This is the longest running annual report on charitable giving in the United States. It is published by the Giving USA Foundation, which is connected to Giving Institute, a consortium of leading fundraising consulting firms or advancement consulting firms in the country. We were at one time known as the American Association of Fundraising Council, or AAFRC, for those of you like me who are old-timers and remember that name. This research is made possible by contributions made by Giving Institute firm members and then foundations and other donors. It is researched and written by the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, which is a leading academic entity associated with philanthropy in this country, and we're very pleased to have that partnership with the Lilly School. So let's look at the data and what it actually tells us this year. $373.25 billion contributed in this country last year. That comes to $1 billion a day, which we're pretty excited about. This is the second consecutive year of record giving in this country and represents an increase of 4.1% over 2014. I'd like to note that all 4 sources of giving have increased levels this year in this report. A couple of other points that we think are important. $100 million or more gifts are proving to have an increasing impact on philanthropy, and a lot of people are thinking about those kinds of larger gifts, and that's a truly large gift, right? So those kinds of gifts equal $3.3 billion. That's a lot of money, but I want to remind our listeners that it's really less than 1% of all giving. So broad-based giving remains very relevant in this total and very important to all the nonprofit organizations represented in this webinar. Giving has increased 23% since the end of the recession, which is pretty terrific. The recession, I'm sure you all recall it. It ended in 2009, and I think we're happy to have those days behind us. The one other thing that I'd like to point out on this slide visually is the extent to which individuals drive giving in this country. You can see that individuals comprise 71% of giving, and then if you add the pie associated with bequests, which is 9%, and take note of the fact that 64% of foundation giving comes from family foundations, it's our estimate that about 88% of all giving is driven by individuals. The obvious point being, if we're not working to build individual giving, it's very difficult to have a broadly successful program of philanthropy at your nonprofit organization. Let's look at giving by individuals, the largest driver of philanthropy. It finished at $264.58 billion last year, which was an increase of 3.8%. I think it's interesting to note that $2.85 billion of this amount came from individuals who made gifts of $300 million or more. It's also important to note that it is estimated that 80% of that $2.85 billion came from individuals associated in the tech industry. This is a real sea change in individual giving because individuals in the tech industry, by and large, are younger than the traditional lead donors have been in some past years in this research. Adults 18 years old or older are estimated to be giving on average $1,100 annually. Some of the larger gifts, Michael Bloomberg, one of the highest net worth person in the state of New York, who every year seems to make this list, made a gift of $500 million to various causes to which he is associated. Pierre and Pan Omidyar, Pierre is the founder of eBay. They made a gift of $327 million primarily to their own foundation. Stefan and Gail Neeson made a gift of $400 million to the Art Institute of Chicago. I'd like to note that this is a gift of artwork and represents a trend in giving this year. And then John Paulson gave $400 million to Harvard. If you look at the $1 million list, which is another source of research from the Lilly Family School, it indicates that there are fewer $1 million donors this year, but the aggregate total is greater than in prior years. And then finally, there is the Bank of America High Net Worth study, also done by the Lilly School. And I'd like to note that that study estimates that high net worth individuals, defined as people who earn $200,000 or more a year and or have a net worth of greater than $1 million, it's estimated by the Lilly School that about half of all individual giving comes from those sources. However, I just want to remind you that the obvious, that what that means is that half of all giving comes from those of lesser means, and that's a very important part of how we build strong programs of philanthropy. Giving by foundations last year finished at $58.5 billion roughly, an increase of 6.5%. Independent foundations were up 6%, operating foundations were up 8.1%, and community foundations were up 7.4%. I want to remind you that family foundations represent 64% of this total. Independent foundations and community foundations both experienced a net increase in assets of about 8% last year, which drives a lot of their increased giving. Let me note that some of those increase in assets are due to fundraising, especially in the community foundation sector. I speak to you here from Chicago today, and the Chicago Community Trust, one of the largest and oldest community foundations in the country, announced it had successfully completed a $1.5 billion multi-year campaign last December. I just want to remind you that all these foundations tend to operate off what we call rolling estimated asset base of over 8 to 12 quarters to even out ups and downs in their annual giving. Looking at giving by bequest, it finished at $31.76 billion last year, an increase of 2.1%. Estates of $1 million and above accounted for $25.4 billion of this total, which, again, on the flip side means that estates below $1 million accounted for $6.3 billion of the total. I just want to remind all our listeners that building even a modest bequest program is very important to a comprehensive fundraising program. Some of the larger bequests last year include a $759 million bequest from Richard Mellon Scaife to the Allegheny Foundation, a $605 million bequest from John Santikos to his own fund housed in the San Antonio Area Foundation, and $293 million from William Scheid to Princeton University. As I will note later, that was a gift of manuscripts made to Princeton University. Giving by corporations finished at just about $18.5 billion last year. It's the highest level ever for corporate giving, and it increased 3.9% over the prior year. Pre-tax profits for corporations across the country rose by 3.3% last year. That's the single largest macro driver in corporate giving. 0.08% of pre-tax profits were dedicated toward philanthropy across the country. We estimate, and I say we, I mean Giving USA and the Lilly Family School, estimate that cash giving accounts for 83% of this total, and pharmaceutical giving, which is largely medications and patient assistance programs, accounted for $6.5 billion. One of the interesting things about corporate giving is that we're seeing when I make these presentations live in a local community, as I did yesterday and will later this week, we see sometimes people in the local community don't feel like corporate giving is rising, and that is because sometimes there's highly coordinated market-related giving done by corporations, and sometimes corporations are not, sometimes there are fewer corporate headquarters in whatever city it is in which I might be speaking. And finally, some corporations we hear focus less on their geographic markets than they do their strategic markets. So it's a very interesting topic overall, from which I'm interested in hearing from our panelists on. So if you look at these changes in giving by source over a 2-year period, first let me tell you that this is the highest 2-year total return. It's double-digit total return that we've seen in about 20 years in this research. And so total giving up 12.2% over a 2-year period, individual giving up 9.1%. And let me note that these two sources, the macro source of all giving and individual giving, are often closely aligned because of the extent to which individual giving drives the total. Foundation giving over a 2-year period up 17.2%. Bequest giving, very interesting to see how much it went up a year ago, and it's up slightly this year. It's largely driven in the terms of the total amount by very large bequests, and so it depends, frankly, on whether some subset of very wealthy people who happen to have made significant estate plans pass away in a given year. But it's up 30% over 2 years, and then corporate giving up 16.3% over a 2-year period. Let's look at these sources in 5-year patterns going back to 1976, and without getting into detailed analysis of this, let me just say that the change in individual giving from 84% on the left hand of your screen to 72% on your right hand of your screen is largely associated with the growth of foundation giving, which is driven by family foundations, which is largely individual giving, as I had noted earlier. And if you were to account for that in this slide, you'd find that the totals are remarkably similar, not entirely identical, but remarkably similar in the patterns over the life of this research. Let's take a look at where that money went last year. There are 9 categories here. Let me note that 8 of 9 of these categories experienced increases in giving in the past year. And I'll say a little bit more about the one area that did not experience an increase last year when I get to that slide. Remarkably, to me, if you look at the share of each entity, like religion at 32%, education at 15%, human service at 12%, on down the line, those percentages and shares remained identical to last year. We think that there's a fairly normalized pattern of giving right now because the economy has been growing modestly for several years. When the economy is way down, we see shifts to basic human needs, and when the market is highly productive, we see very big gifts to certain destinations. And this was a year of modest growth in a series of years of modest growth. And so that it just so happened that the shares ended up to be identical to last year. 5 of these subsectors grew more than 5% last year, which is terrific news. So let's look at giving to religion. Historically, this has always been the biggest destination for all philanthropy in this country. It's not as large of a share of the total as it once was. It finished at $119 billion, growth of 2.7%. Religion has experienced 5 consecutive years of growth, but it's growing more slowly than other sectors. It was 6th out of 9 in the last 5 years. Unaffiliated people, when I say that, let me back up and say, we've been trying to examine why giving to religion has been slowing down. And there's a growing number of people who declare themselves as unaffiliated to any church, synagogue, or house of worship. And remember that giving to religion is largely driven by people who go to a house of worship every week. They're involved in a community and they're asked to give. This is a pattern that can be replicated in a wide range of philanthropic entities. Specifically, the Christian population is noted to be declining, and within that subset, evangelical Protestants are of a smaller number than they've been historically. And we think that's impacting giving to religion. This includes congregations and houses of worship, national offices of faith groups, missionary societies, and religious media. Let's look at giving to education. We're going to be very interested to hear from Sue Cunningham on this in a few minutes. It finished at $57.48 billion, an increase of 8.9% last year. It is estimated that 70% of this total was given to higher education. The growth in this sector has exceeded 5% in 4 out of the last 5 years. And this sector received 8 gifts of over $100 million last year that we were able to note. There's a growing trend of gifts of artwork and manuscripts. Right now, we think in part that's because those kinds of collections are valued very highly, but also there are significant tax advantages to making gifts of that type. The data notes that alumni giving increased 10.2%. Just some of the very large gifts: Northwestern University received 3 gifts of over $100 million last year. Stanford University received a $600 million gift of artwork from the extended Anderson family, and by the way, announced that they would build a building to house that artwork, so that might decrease the net gain on the total gift, but still a very substantial contribution and a valuable contribution to the university. And then Princeton University received a $300 million gift of rare books and manuscripts, to which I referred earlier in this presentation. Giving to human services finished at $45.21 billion, an increase of 4.2% last year. This is the highest amount ever, and there are other reports that are aggregated or at least referred to in the Giving USA report suggest that online giving is increasing significantly in this sector. There's a lesson there, in our opinion, that donors may choose for a wide range of reasons to make a gift. We note in annual giving programs, these are multi-channel programs that all the channels together, whether it be phone, letter, email, e-blast, contribute to cause somebody to make a decision to give. But once they do, it's very important they have a very easy way to make a gift online, because this is how a lot of gifts are actually made once the decision to make a gift is made by the donor. The growth in this sector is not as fast as other sectors. A couple of things that I'd like to note. that, as I noted earlier, when the economy is truly struggling, some donors shift their giving to basic human needs. The other thing that I would note here is that this sector, by and large, has a bigger challenge building individual giving programs because they do not have alumni, they do not have grateful patients, and they do not have subscribers like some of the other entities here. I did note in some of the background materials with the research that Feeding America's growth last year beat this sector considerably. We'll be interested to hear from Diana on that in just a few minutes. Giving to foundations is the only sector that actually experienced a decline last year, which might seem surprising at first. It finished at $42.26 billion, a decrease of 3.8%. But this does follow 4 years of average growth estimated at approximately 14.5%, and it's actually the fastest growing area over the past 5 years. Just want to say a quick note about donor-advised funds. I'm going to make a couple of comments about them, one here and one a little bit later in the presentation. This is a significant growing phenomenon in philanthropy. It's estimated that donor-advised funds account for 5.5% of all giving. And when you look at giving to foundations, it includes community foundations, which increasingly are using donor-advised funds to help donors manage their philanthropy over the long haul. Giving to donor-advised funds has increased 12,000%, that's 1,000% since 1991. Let's look at giving to health, $29.8 billion last year, a relatively modest increase of 1.3%. This category as described in this data is a little bit surprising to me. It has a slower growth rate over the 5-year period compared to other subsectors. And not all data agrees. Blackbaud did a sample that showed a 7.2% growth among the respondents to that particular survey. There was a $192 million gift to support cancer research in this total. What we find at Campbell & Company is that giving to healthcare is highly complex, and those organizations that align around the value of philanthropy, from the CEO to the board to a well-resourced development program, can do very well philanthropically. And organizations that do not do that are relegated mostly to special event types of giving. The other note I'd like to make is that some large gifts for research that went to academic medical centers may have been counted in the education sector as it relates to giving to health. Public society benefit, almost $27 billion last year, an increase of 6%. Some may ask, what is public society benefit? It's giving to voter education, civil rights, consumer rights, freestanding research, and public policy research. It also includes the United Ways and the Jewish Federations of the world. And then finally, the commercial donor-advised funds, the Schwabs and Fidelities of the world, are housed in this category. It is estimated that those funds, donor-advised funds in this category, account for 1/3 to 1/2 of the total. My other fun fact about donor-advised funds, as I said, we believe it accounts for about 5.5% of all giving. Chances are, if you run any kind of comprehensive fundraising program today, you have multiple individuals who are supporting you through their donor-advised fund, and it's something very important to be aware of going forward. Giving to arts, culture, and humanities finished at about $17 billion last year. That's an increase of 7%. This sector fluctuates quite a bit depending on the economy. It was hit hard during the recession, and now it has seen some very significant increases. This is the 4th consecutive year of growth at an average of 7.5%. When the economy is strong, some other research that Campbell & Company has funded through the Lilly family, or at the time we did it, it was known as the Center on Philanthropy. What we found is the average donor to arts, culture, and humanities compared to the broader donor population tends to live in urban areas, tends to have a higher level of education, and tends to give to a broader range of entities than other donors. What we believe, which is not specifically stipulated in the research, that when the economy is really struggling, this kind of donors goes and shifts money to basic human needs and other things that he or she thinks are important given the economic times. And when they're doing very well in terms of appreciated assets, they make large gifts to the arts and culture community in their hometown to support that quality of life in their community. Let's look at giving to international affairs. It accounts for $15.75 billion, an increase of 17.5% over last year. These are organizations involved in international aid, development or relief, foreign policy research, international human rights. The growth in online giving is also noted in this area by the background information associated with the Giving at USA research. And finally, disaster relief always plays a large role in this category. It's estimated that the earthquake in Nepal and the disaster relief contributed from around the world and significantly from this country accounts for about 50% of all giving in the U.S. in this category. I think the larger issue here is that this is over the longer haul is one of the faster growing entities in this research. And one of the reasons for that is that we think increasingly your donors with whom you interact on a regular basis see themselves as a citizen of the world in addition to being involved in your nonprofit organization, which is great. We just think that you should be aware that donors' views of how to make an impact philanthropically are evolving, and the growth in this category, we believe, indicates that. When you look at giving to the environment, this is another sector that does well when the economy is strong. It finished at $10.68 billion, an increase of 6.2% last year. We are finding that climate change and clean energy are causes of very significant interest to many people, including wealthy individuals. We had this webinar last year and had a guest from the Global Office of the Nature Conservancy who told us that 90% of TNC's support comes from gifts of $10,000 or more, which I think is really quite impressive. This is the sixth consecutive year of growth in this category, average growth over that time period of $6.2 billion. So if you look at the 2-year time frame here on each of these entities, religion is up 6.2%. Education really growing both in terms of broad giving, alumni giving, and major gift fundraising, up 14.4%. Human service giving, 7.8% increase. Giving to foundations over a 2-year period, just 1.1%, but remember that slightly longer term trend that sees greater growth in this entity. Giving to health, 6.2% over a 2-year period. Public society benefit, 11.2%. Arts, culture, and humanities, almost 18% growth over the last 2 years. International affairs, 12.2%, entirely driven by growth in this past year of 17.4%. And then environment and animals, steady, good growth accounting to 14% over a 2-year period. Now this is a very busy slide that you're looking at, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it for no other reason that the color delineation is not all that terrific. But anyway, let me just say that what we believe about these trends is that the loss or the reduced share of the total accounted for by giving to religion, and remember it's still the largest share in the pie, is mostly accounted for by increased giving to foundations, to international affairs, and to environment and animals. And in fact, at the very beginning of this slide, back in 1976, international affairs and environment and animals wasn't even tracked in the overall total. So if you were to control for that amount, I think you'd see a fairly otherwise stable picture on how people view philanthropy, but those are the broadest changes over this time period. Let's look at a few slides that show the relationship between the economy and giving in this country. First of all, giving as a percentage of the gross domestic product. This is, if we could get to 2.5% of the gross domestic product in terms of giving, that would be the single biggest way that we could move the needle on philanthropy in this country. We're happy about a couple of things. It's almost at an all-time high over the life of this research. The other thing that I would note. If you look over a 5-year period, the GDP has been growing at an average of 2%, and philanthropy has been growing at an average of 3.5%. So growth of philanthropy right now in this 5-year period is outpacing the growth in the gross domestic product. We're happy about that. If you look at total giving from 1975 to 2015, this slide, please note that the gold bands are years in which we are in some sort of recession. And overall, what we find is that in years where we're in a recession, giving either levels off or grows more slowly. There have been 3 instances where giving has actually declined since 1975. 2 of those came during the Great Recession. And so when the economy is growing, philanthropy grows very much more quickly. And so this, you can see these last 3 years that the ladder there, or the ramp, looks very similar to what we saw in the late 90s. So these are good years for growth in philanthropy when you look at a multi-year period. The relationship between Standard & Poor's and giving is very closely connected. And I think what I'd like to say about this slide, with total giving being the yellow band and the dotted giving being S&P 500 in 2015 dollars, is that giving reacts to the markets, but more gradually and with less volatility than the markets themselves tend to go up and down. The reason that we think this is important is within this area, if the market goes way down, for instance, those organizations that are doing a good job of stewarding donors are likely to feel less effect of a downturn in the market. One of the things we've learned over the years at Campbell & Company through various research and talking to people is that when donors cut back on their giving, they tend to cut back on the number of entities to which they give before they cut back on the amount they give to their favorite charities. And so the lesson here is to cherish your donors, to steward them well, and they will try to help account for your organization if they're well stewarded and they care about the cause when financial markets decline. Giving is closely related to disposable personal income. It relates to income, but it also relates to just the amount of money that people have to spend. Philanthropy, from an economic measurement standpoint, according to the Lilly family, is largely a matter of related to consumption. We'd like to think that philanthropy is a basic need for all people, and we try to grow that sense among our donors, and some feel that way, but they really give out of what, obviously out of what's available to them to give. And so personal disposable income and, frankly, consumption are 2 statistics that relate closely to philanthropy. I mentioned earlier that corporate giving as a percentage of corporate pre-tax profit is an important indicator. Looked at in 1975 and 2015, we got 0.8% of all corporate pre-tax profits going to philanthropy. So that's a very stable trend over the life of this research. A couple of slides I want to leave you with. First of all, volunteer rate as a share of the U.S. population. 1/4 of us volunteer for some organization about which we care. And I want to encourage everybody listening today to remember how valuable volunteers are to our organizations, and to remind you that most volunteers either give or have a very high priority or have a high priority of giving to the organizations in which they're involved as volunteers, and encourage you to really cherish your volunteers, encourage them to be involved, let them know how philanthropy impacts the mission they care about, and ask them to give. It's a call to really acknowledge the value of volunteerism in this country and its connection to philanthropy. And then finally, in case you think you're not in a competitive market, which I doubt you feel, there are 1.184 million nonprofit organizations in this country. And I'd like to leave you, before I turn it over to my colleague Kate, with the notion that how important it is that we take good care of our donors. There's some data in this research that indicates, and in our experience over time, that indicates if we could just do a better job of donor retention, our programs of philanthropy would naturally grow. And I want to encourage you, and we may have some dialogue about this with the panelists, how important donor stewardship is to your programs. I think that it's our nature to some degree to be constantly seeking new donors, which we absolutely have to do. But what we find is that if you acquire a new donor and then can get them to repeat their gift for 2 or 3 years, chances are, unless something significant happens to them, or if we do not take good care of them, they're a donor for life. That makes them a planned giving prospect. That makes them a major gift prospect. All of those things that happen over time. But it starts with truly cherishing the donors that we do have. And I just want to remind you, with all these nonprofit organizations, if we're not taking care of our donors, someone else with a good cause will come to them and talk about the impact they could make with their philanthropy. So with that, I want to thank you very much for your time and attention, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kate Roosevelt, who's going to engage our panelists in discussion. Thank you. Kate?
Thank you, Peter, and good day, everyone. Great to be with you, and as always, to be peeling back the layers of the onion of this really important research. We're going to turn our attention now to 3 experts in the nonprofit and philanthropic sector who have been gracious enough to spend some time with us today to help ground this very important and interesting data in their real-world experience and perspective, to help us make sense of the data and let us know how it syncs up with their own experience as well, and the experience of their constituents. I want to note that the 3 people that we have today, Sue Cunningham from the Council for Advancement and Support of Education, the president of that organization, Steve Churchill, the president and CEO of the Association for Healthcare Philanthropy, otherwise known as AHP, and Diana Aviv, the CEO of Feeding America, who I'm sure many of you also recognize from her role leading independent sector up until, I guess it was about a year ago, Diana. These 3 people represent sectors that in turn represent 35% of the philanthropic activity that happened in our country last year. They're 3 of the 4 largest recipient sectors. The third is actually giving to foundations. So between education, human services, and healthcare, we've got 35% of giving represented in our panelists today. So thank you again for being with us. Over the course of the next 35 or 40 minutes, we're going to do a number of things. First of all, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves and share 3 to 5 minutes of their sort of top line observations. And again, how does this data resonate with them? What elements of it brings questions to their mind, and how does it sync up with their real world experience? Then we're going to take them through a series of questions, and then we will have some time at the end, 10 to 15 minutes to respond to your questions. I'm happy that some folks have already been sending questions in. If you would like to send us a question, we will attempt to get to it during the webinar today. If we're not able to due to time, we will respond to you following the webinar, and would be happy even to hop on the phone with you to discuss your questions about the report today. So without spending too much more time on this, I think we should jump into hearing from our panelists, and I'd like to start by welcoming Sue Cunningham from CASE to share with us her high-level reactions and tell us a little bit about herself and what she's seeing in the world of education philanthropy these days. Thank you, Sue.
Well, Kate, thank you very much for the introduction, and Peter for your brilliant walkthrough a few minutes ago of the outcome of Giving USA this year, and it's a pleasure to join you. I've been president of CASE for just over a year, and before that I worked in advancement leading philanthropic campaigns at the University of Melbourne in Australia, at the University of Oxford in the UK, and the University of St Andrews in Scotland. And it's a great honour and privilege to be leading the Council for Advancement and Support of Education, or as it's fondly known, CASE. It's really exciting to see the incredible impact of the hard work of so many of our membership at CASE in the increase of 8.9% in philanthropic support for education in this year's report, and that to be at 57.48 billion in contributions is a huge tribute to the care and focus and energy of many educational organizations in the United States, together, of course, vitally with the support of generous and visionary donors. I think coming at it from a CASE perspective, and I'm sure that CASE will be familiar to many participants in this webinar, our membership numbers over 3,700 institutions in higher education in community colleges and in schools in 82 countries around the world, with nearly 80% of our membership here in the US. So the work, for example, of our commissions, which are really think tanks looking at horizon issues to do with higher education in fundraising, alumni relations, communications, and marketing, whether it be around the research and the surveys that are driven by CASE, together with our information center, which provides a valuable or an invaluable, I'd say, data resource for our membership worldwide. The information coming out of this survey in many respects aligns with the work that we're doing and complements the information that is vital and valuable in advancing the work that is going on. A really interesting statistic that I was looking at earlier, when one looks at the significant growth and obviously in terms of giving to education in this context, the scale of giving to education has now well exceeded. I think it happened in 2013, the dip that occurred around the GFC, which is truly magnificent considering, as Peter was saying a few minutes ago, the implications overall to the philanthropic sector at that point in time. But that has grown is truly remarkable. But of the increase in looking at the giving to education, I understand that about 70% of it is going to higher education, universities, and so on, and that 30% is going to schools and libraries. But in terms of focusing in on what has contributed to that growth, I mean, at the heart of it, as we all know, is the real focus and attention to relationship building and integrity in doing so, and in the important work that is happening in the institutions. But I'd also say, in terms of particular aspects that I was interested in, and I think it's important, one is around the focus, as was being described a few minutes ago, on these major campaigns, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a little while, and also looking at the growth in the work that's happening in community college foundations, as was mentioned earlier. And one final point I think I'd make before finishing my introduction is the growth in philanthropy to education, which there are many generations of evidence of its huge impact in the United States, is rippling, as we all know, to other shores. And most recently, The Economist quoted last week a survey that CASE has been running for many years in the UK and now in Australia, the Ross Case survey, which measures philanthropy in those parts of the world. And over the last 10 years in the UK, philanthropy has gone up 412% to education. And in no small way, I know that the magnificent work that is done here in the USA has provided an inspiration to work that is going on in other parts of the world. So I think the outcomes of this study will be hugely informing, not just to our members on these shores, but members in many other places as well.
Thank you, Sue. Really eye-opening and great to hear your perspective. We'll get back to you, look forward to hearing from you on some questions that I think your comments prompt, so thank you so much. Next, I'd like to ask Steve Churchill with the Association of Healthcare Philanthropy to share his introduction and to kind of share his thoughts with us about how this data is landing with him as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I serve as the President and CEO of the Association for Healthcare Philanthropy, and we're located in Washington, D.C. Prior to that, I served as the Executive Director of the American Medical Association Foundation in Chicago. And AHP is an international professional organization dedicated to helping men and women who encourage charity for nonprofit hospitals and healthcare organizations. We have about 5,000 members representing more than 2,200 healthcare organizations in North America and abroad. Our members primarily are in the United States and Canada. In terms of my observations at a high level of the report, coming from the healthcare sector, this is really a time of dramatic change. Philanthropy is really a growing and increasingly vital component of hospital or health systems to serve their mission. At one time, healthcare philanthropy may not have taken much notice from the CEO of a hospital or the C-suite, but as hospitals face intense pressure in terms of their profit lines due to the Accountable Care Act and other factors, they're increasingly turning to their foundations to provide additional revenue to meet their mission. And I think what we find is that during times of disruption and change, as healthcare is going through now, it's really the high performers that stand out. And we focus on benchmarking in our industry, and what we see from our report on giving at AHP is that those that do benchmark and focus on best practices and focus on improvement grow and benefit from results, and quite honestly, those that don't may be left behind. Certainly, it appears as though the overall improvement in the economy, the increase in the GDP over last year, the strong performance for Standard & Poor's, or at least consistent, I think, has had a calming effect for donors. And when you look specifically at the healthcare sector, I saw from the report that a quarter of health organizations are in campaigns, and that matches the data we have from our report on giving. We're still at about 8% of the entire philanthropic pie, so we haven't grown, but we've remained steady. Unlike Sue Cunningham in higher education, healthcare philanthropy in terms of hospitals and healthcare organizations is a relatively new sector, whereas higher education has been doing it for hundreds of years. It's really just been the last 30 to 35 years that healthcare philanthropy has been a significant emphasis for hospitals. And even with that, the difference between healthcare philanthropy when you look at hospitals is that they traditionally have other strong lines of revenue for their institutions, and still today, healthcare philanthropy really only represents about 3% of overall revenue for hospitals and healthcare systems.
Thank you, Steve. Really interesting to hear your perspective on some of the pressures that your colleagues are under for sure, and the increasing focus on growing philanthropy in the healthcare context. So thank you so much, and stay tuned for some more questions in just a minute. Diana Aziz, I'd love to turn it over to you. You are currently the president and CEO of Feeding America, which I know works with many affiliates and partners across the country, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts, a little bit about yourself and your thoughts and your perspective on what this data means, particularly in the context of our human services sector. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. And I must say, in listening to Sue, I was beginning to feel that this is the United Nations conversation between Shimi and all of us. So, but at be it, I have been at Feeding America for 8.5 months, drinking from a fire hose, but nevertheless there for 8 months. And as you mentioned, or in your introductory remarks, I was the previous 12 years at Independent Sector, which was the leadership forum for foundations, nonprofits, and corporate giving programs. For those of you unfamiliar with Feeding America, it is the largest nonprofit hunger relief organization in the United States, and overall the third largest nonprofit, which is quite a statement given that it's only 35 years old. It has a network of 200 food banks which serve every part of the United States in terms of providing food, and affiliated with those 200 food banks are over 60,000 food pantries, meal programs, soup kitchens, and those sorts of programs that work in partnership with the food banks. Together, every year, we feed 46 million people, which includes 12 million children and 7 million people over the age of 60. And just this past year, we served 3.5 billion meals, and we do that each year, although our goal is to reach higher than that and to serve many more meals. Now, I think that the interest here is in the impact of these data, or not so much the impact of these data on our efforts, because in fact these data will help us think about what we do going forward, but how we relate to them. And let me just say that for Feeding America, we raise, the national organization, not the affiliates, the national organization raises $2 billion a year, of which the substantial part of that are non-cash contributions, i.e. food, that we get from producers, retailers, manufacturers, and wholesalers of food. If you add the members, the affiliated members with us, and they are affiliated by a over 80-page contract, so there's a very strong connection, we're almost an $8 billion enterprise. My remarks are now going to be confined, unless I'm specifically asked, to what the national organization does, what its budget looks like. And I heard a comment about that we did better than what the national stats are. I think sometimes that's revealing and sometimes that's not reflective, but let me just share where we sit in all of this. For us, apart from the hundreds of thousands of pounds of food that is donated, in terms of cash revenue, 60% of our funding comes from the corporate sector. And I know that's not typical for other nonprofits and certainly not for those in the human service arena, but we get 60%. And that's both cash and contribution. But now I'm talking only in the cash arena. In direct marketing, which includes online, we get 40% of our funds. Major gifts are 13%, foundations 3%, and at this point in time, we don't receive any government funding at all. My response to the big picture human services is that there were positives and negative takeaways for us. On the positive side, for all human service organizations, I think, is the fact that human service organizations received 12% of total charitable giving, which is the third of total gifts, and I think that that's pretty heartwarming. I think that contributions to human services in 2015 totaled the highest amount adjusted for inflation since 1975. Which was when this study started. And there's also a strong uptick on online giving. All good news for those people operating in this space. On the not so positive side is that there's a downward trend. Giving increased 5.3% between 2013 and 14 and only grew by 4.2% between 14 and 15. In overall dollars, there's more, but nevertheless, in the rate of growth, and I think that, and also when adjusted for inflation, increased by only 0.5%. We've thought long and hard about those data and what that means, and we've thought about that long before the study came out. In fact, this study reflected what we have seen among the affiliates, which is that there's a softness in fundraising that they haven't seen for the last 6 years. And that's not a big surprise considering what our cause is, which is hunger in America. So when the public thinks that there are more people facing hunger, like in the downturn of an economy, we are likely to see greater giving in this area. And with the official releases of unemployment hovering at now below 5%, notwithstanding the fact that there are massive wealth and income inequalities, and even though consumer confidence declined in April and May, the fact of the matter is that we are still seeing a softness because we believe that the public thinks that this problem is not as steep as it was in the past. We're seeing, like perhaps many of you, that there's a tremendous demand. In our case, even though the economy appears to have been in a recovery form, it's the kind of recovery form that doesn't sit well with our food banks, given the fact that there are 48 million people in the United States who are food insecure, and including 15 million children. And so, and that's 1 in 5 kids. and also that food insecurity rates have remained historically high based upon our own studies. And when giving drops, sadly, often it's who are the people who suffer. They're the people who can least afford to suffer. I'll just say very briefly about donors, particularly in the corporate space, and make 2 comments about them, since those are the donors that support the bulk of our work. And that is that we've been around for just over 35 years, and one of our first partners ever was General Mills, the corporation, and continues to be our partner to this day. Most grocery stores and food manufacturers, but not all. We have partners like Morgan Stanley, DLA Piper, PricewaterhouseCoopers, those kinds are also partners. And that I think that as profoundly important as the statistics are, that in the final analysis, the kind of conversation or discussion about the importance of volunteers and giving doesn't reflect the texture of what happens in these kinds of relationships, particularly in the corporate space. It seems to me that success with corporations is fundamentally increasingly tied to the ability of nonprofit organizations to connect also with the employees of that corporation, and that the corporation are more likely to drive their dollars to organizations that can also make the employees feel satisfied in their job because of the opportunity to volunteer and to give in their own way, so that it's an integrated kind of approach. So for us, from corporations, we look for philanthropic giving, cause marketing, product donations, and employee engagement. And for us, the ideal partnership hits all 4 pillars. Last point to make is that it's not only the large corporations giving these multi-million-dollar gifts that matter, but also mid-level donors. And many times, the way in which we have found mid-level donors giving is by linking a significant donor to the opportunity for mid-level donors to match that major gift. And in those kinds of instances, those kinds of engagements of connecting people, we're able to magnify gifts and find that people give twice as much. But we can get back to that in the Q&A. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much, Diana. And pardon the pun, amazing food for thought. Yes, I did just say that. But in all seriousness, you have given us a lot to think about. All 3 of you have, and I think that now is the time for us to jump into some follow-up questions. So thank you all so much. And I'll do my best to sort of direct these to each of you, or open it up to all 3 of you. I think my first question, maybe starting with Sue and Steve, is really about the role of the mega gifts and the mega donors, and how that's affecting the work in your respective sectors of education and healthcare. As Peter reported, we know that gifts of $100 million or more accounted for $3.3 billion of total giving. We know that many of these folks are considering gifts of appreciated property, appreciated securities. We know that more giving in the country is concentrated at the top, and Peter referenced in particular the role that those who have become wealthy through their affiliations with the technology industry are playing a major role in these mega gifts. And I'd love to hear just more from you about what you're seeing in terms of sort of the role that mega donors are playing, and how does it influence your work on the philanthropic side, but also the work that you're doing from a mission perspective.
Shall I leap in first, Kate? I think that it's absolutely right to have a conversation about these really significant gifts. As I think I mentioned in my introduction, one trend that was referred to earlier and that we've all experienced and are seeing is the growth in campaigns, and really ambitious campaigns. In the CASE campaign report that we run, we see that there are 61 active campaigns in institutions of $1 billion or more in the United States, which is really significant. And again, if one looks at the scale of ambition of these campaigns, there are many that are truly multi-billion campaigns, and the ambition and the vital involvement of significant donors in succeeding in those outcomes are critical. And again, from our campaign report, the CASE campaign report in 2013, the latest report suggests that 10% of donors provide 94% of the total campaign goal. And if one looks even narrower, the top 1% provides 78% of the goal. So one's looking at some really significant gifts, and Peter mentioned a few of them earlier, that are having a profound effect in that regard. But the other thing I'd say in the context of the focus on campaigns for a moment is looking at the community college sector, which is coming much, much more strongly into the space of building as philanthropic support. And again, when we look at the results from the CASE survey of community college foundations, we're seeing that more than 3/4 of foundations that have responded were either planning a campaign, had one in progress, or had recently completed a campaign. So the level of ambition in this space and the growth of activity is very significant, and major and principal gifts have a key role to play in all of this.
Thanks, Sue. Steve, any perspective from the healthcare sector on this topic of mega gifts?
When you look at healthcare philanthropy, it's really the hospitals that are tied to academic research centers that are experiencing the largest growth of large gifts. And there's a big difference between the capacity and sophistication of a children's hospital or an academic center compared to a community hospital. And certainly their cause is compelling, and they're able to reach out to larger donors and to really steward that relationship. And as Sue had mentioned, if you look at healthcare philanthropy, as I said previously, about 1/4 of our members are in campaigns for fundraising at this point in time. I think that the rise in donor advised funds has made it easier for individuals to give their resources. It can be complicated to start a family foundation, but you can start a donor advised fund literally in a day. And so I think that is really making philanthropy more accessible and easier for another new generation of donors. And typically baby boomers tend to be individuals who like to see the impact of their gift compared to the generation before them that might be happy simply to give to an institution. Baby boomers are more impact focused. When you think about expanding mid-level giving, I think that's important because as Michael Bloomberg, who just recently made a huge gift to Johns Hopkins University, his first gift to that institution was when he was a student, and it was $10. And so even for those mega gifts, they're going to start someplace. And often that $10 will be started in the annual fund. And still with hospitals, annual fund giving is the largest piece of their pie in terms of the number of donors, or about 20%. And I think that the trick is to move people up through the buckets, through the life cycle of giving. It's going to be interesting to look at the numbers from Giving USA in terms of the demographics which are shifting. How will millennials give differently than the baby boomers? How will online giving in the form of crowdfunding and experience-based activities differ from the baby boomers? Many of the hospitals that we're looking at in terms of bringing people to the cycle are really asking donors and prospective donors to think about what they aspire to in terms of their legacy, and really looking at a lifetime plan that will include blended gifts as opposed to just focusing on single major gifts. And of course, social media is a factor, and it's really, in our sector, more of a factor in terms of engagement and fundraising than it is fundraising, but certainly has a lot of upside potential as well, as we're looking for new ways to keep people in the loop rather than just reaching out to donors for the quarterly visit. We're finding that the successful organizations have a sophisticated plan that touches their donors throughout the year, and often social media is a big part of that. That will conclude my comments for now.
Thank you, Steve, and such a good reminder that while it may appear to us that mega gifts drop out of the sky, often they're the result of a very long-term nurturing relationship that an individual or a family has with an institution. So thank you for that reminder, and also I think to remind us that more and more we see these largest gifts being very nuanced. It's the term you use, the blended gift, I think is also something important for us to keep our eye on. Moving down the gift pyramid, so to speak, a bit, and Diana, you talked a little bit about middle donors. I think to refer back to something that Peter pointed out, while 50% of giving from individuals comes from high net worth individuals, it's important to note that the other 50% comes from people who are not high net worth individuals. And it would be great to hear more from you about how Feeding America is looking at and what you're doing to sort of activate this middle part of the pyramid, and to the extent that Sue and Steve would like to weigh in, as it relates to alumni giving or grateful patient giving or what have you, that'd be helpful too. But Diana, could you perhaps share a little bit more about how you're looking at activating the middle donors?
Sure. Let me start by saying that the definition of a mid-level donor begins on where you begin and what you consider to be a large gift and what you consider to be a modest gift. When we have a cash budget that we have to raise of $120 plus million, this coming year $125 million, raising money in $5,000 increments, unless it's from a massive, very wide base, would require so much more effort than if we were able to target very large donors. But as has been pointed out already, many times those very large donors may start as modest donors, very modest donors as students, university students, or a little bigger than that, and end up being the mega donors down the road. And if you haven't cultivated them at the lower end and think only of your bottom line in a way in which you've got to get to this very big number, so let's go after the biggest, you may in fact be missing profound opportunities of long-term investment in those mega donors by starting sooner. But as I say, the definition of what is a mid-level donor will vary from organization to organization. In our case, we cultivate mid-level donors through many different channels. We consider them really important to reach out through phone calls, through events, through in-person visits, through emails, and through newsletters. Now, everybody would say, yeah, well, so do we. How do you get them to actually catch a hold? And I think that in the case of human service organizations, although I'm sure this is true in other fields as well, that there's nothing like deep engagement. The value of volunteers are not only in the service that they can provide to the organization that otherwise wouldn't be able to do that work, it's also in bringing people closer to the cause and feeling like their value is increased by both giving time, and often that will turn out into a gift. So we have in our network over 2 million volunteers. And so deep engagement at the local level, in our case via our food banks and agencies, and urging them to be involved in the Hype to End hunger in their neighborhoods, all those kinds of things, being involved in our policy work, and all of that has made a difference. We've also found things that is just, close your eyes, it's just so obvious, but I want to say them just in case we forget. One is that to consistently thank donors all the time and to let them know how their gift mattered. and increasingly important to donors is to tell them how we're actually using their donation. And we send out a quarterly donor impact report. I've seen that some of the most effective fundraising organizations actually have visual images that allow donors to literally track and see, almost like going through the intestines, the human body, where the food goes, and so to see where the donation goes. Handwritten notes, phone calls, visits, and in high concentration areas, personalized outreach mattered, and as I said, to get them involved. In terms of mid-level donors as well, I mentioned a matching donation. We actually had this experience with two donors, one of whom was very famous, and the other one wasn't known at all. One could argue that in the case of the person who's quite well known, people wanted to match his gift because he was that well known and felt that they were part of his experience. But we did a similar project with somebody who wasn't well known at all, and people increased their gifts that allowed us to get to where we needed to go much faster than otherwise we would have thought.
Thank you, Diana. Sue and or Steve, anything you'd like to add to the middle donor discussion?
I think the thing I would add, and I heartily sort of reinforce what both Diana and Steve have said about the fact that some significant donors, many significant donors, are people who started off providing support at a very modest level. And I think what we see with our membership as being a critical part of this is about the inherent focus on relationship building with alumni and with other key stakeholders at different stages in their careers and in their time away from the institution. So particularly when we're looking, for example, at engagement in a university and school context with younger alumni, and looking at specific programs that many of our member institutions are developing to engage younger alumni more broadly with the organization, seems to be a really important aspect of securing that level of engagement and investment over time in many different ways beyond the fiscal.
And this is Steve Church. I think the ground has been covered well, but I think that what we need to remember is that what works today may not work tomorrow, and truly we've had a focus on the baby boomers in terms of being a large generation, but the millennials have surpassed them now. And so we're really going to have to look through the lens of the millennials in terms of how they prefer to interact with organizations, what their needs are, and how we engage them. And it is going to be dramatically different than the generation that we've really focused on in terms of the wealth. And I think you're seeing that from some of the millennials who've made it in the San Fernando Valley in the tech industry, but it doesn't have to be the largest of donors that we focus on in terms of behavior. And I think the smart organizations are connecting with people the way they want to be connected with, and are realizing that these are folks who really are cause-driven and may drift in and out of organizations depending on what cause is the most important to them. It also tends to be a group of individuals who appreciate recognition by their peers, maybe more than even the baby boomers have. And you see that through the crowdfunding campaigns where really having that public recognition in front of all of their friends on Facebook or whatever platform it may be digitally is important and significant to them. And so donor recognition is taking really different forms than having your name on a building.
Thank you, Steve. So a question for any of you, as Peter noted in his review of the data, we see continued growth in giving to donor-advised funds and family foundations, and in turn giving from those sources to the various recipient organizations. For example, I believe that the data tell us that family foundations account for 64% of total foundation giving, and all of this just continues to underscore that individual giving rules the day. Given the growth in donor-advised funds and family foundations as vehicles for individuals to engage with organizations. How are your sectors and your colleagues and your peers adapting or changing their fundraising practices, if at all? What's working?
This is Diana. I just want to make a comment based upon my experience for 12 years at the independent sector with regard to donor-advised funds and family foundations, and say that one of the trends that we saw in the growth of donor-advised funds appeared to be relevant for two reasons. One is that people were increasingly wanting to have much greater control over their own wealth even as they gave it away. And even though donor-advised funds are advised and they're given to a third entity, either a non-profit like a community foundation, or it could be a for-profit like Fidelity or Vanguard or one of those fund distribution entities, that it's much more like donor-directed funds than it is donor-advised funds. In the case of very thoughtful, skilled community foundation leaders, they will work with those individual donors, find out what their interests are, share with them in that sphere of interest what's available, who's doing what, and if those donors are thoughtful and are interested in that information, make informed giving in a different kind of a way. But there's no doubt in my mind that the rapid growth of donor-advised funds is in antithesis to going into private foundations in which the control seems to slip further away from the individual donor. That seems to correlate with a trend that we saw for years of donors being much more interested in being engaged in the solutions and having much more of a hands-on approach. And I think that the giving in that area means that in working with donors who are much more interested in being engaged, if one approaches them with pre-packaged solutions, all strapped up and ties and all of that done, that there's less interest. If one approaches them not so much for gifts but for advice and together to build out the program and then find ways to engage them in it, there's a greater likelihood that they would be interested. And so that takes a very different kind of behavior. Stepping back into my role here at Feeding America, that's not, as we are working with individual donors, we are picking up donors who have already connected with us in the first place and therefore demonstrated their interest. And so in our case, our charge is not to go out and find them, but to find ways to engage their interest in more deeply.
Okay, something I'd add to the important points that Diana has just made is a couple of things. One is around donors becoming involved with the mission of the organization, and obviously the whole ethos of venture philanthropy is very much around that and evidenced in an educational context. Another growing trend that we're seeing with our members is the growth in universities in particular hosting donor-advised funds, from the University of Nebraska to the University of Florida, Johns Hopkins, Stanford, Harvard, others. And in seeing this trend, what we're seeing is really it's an opportunity for a strong connection with donors and with why they're doing what they're doing. And so again, it's intrinsic to that strong connectivity, relationship building, and informing both the institution and the donor of key things that are really vitally important working together to advance education.
Thank you. Thank you, Sue. Let me shift gears for a minute, and then we're going to go to a couple of questions from our audience. And I think the last question I'd like to ask you is about online giving. We seem to be seeing continued significant growth in this way of giving. We see it across sectors. It's been noted certainly in the healthcare sector, the international sector, the human services sector, the international sector, the environmental sector, even arts and culture. We're seeing that online giving is growing faster than all other channels of giving combined. So I'd love to hear any best practices that you have for how you're incorporating and how your colleagues are incorporating online giving into their overall philanthropy strategies.
I'm happy to leap in here, Kate, if that's useful. I mean, one thing I'd say is that the Blackboard report on charitable giving indicated that higher education had the largest increase in online giving for the second year in a row. They saw 15.2% year-over-year increase, with K through 12 education schools also had a 12.3% increase. So as you reflected, this is growing significantly across the sector, and in education that is very much the case too. I think in terms of trend, and Steve touched a few minutes ago on crowdfunding, and that is both manifesting itself in terms of being profoundly mission-based in terms of donors associating themselves with a specific project or program, but also we're seeing a growth in giving days at specific institutions, and a real success in those giving days, both in terms of engaging with existing supporters and key stakeholders, but also strengthening and building relations with younger alumni and with existing alumni in a way that's profoundly impactful.
This is Diana. Let me just say a few things about online giving versus direct marketing. Online giving, a bunch of years ago, not that long ago, because it's not that old, was touted as the big solution, and that if we don't all get behind that immediately, we'll be lost. And I think that was a warning that was worth paying attention to, but not dropping everything else that one did in order to run in that direction. The reason I say that is that still to this day, even as we have invested vigorously in online giving, and we have seen the growth in online giving jump more than 10% each year, it still doesn't match our direct marketing. And I think it speaks to a point that Steve had made earlier about the treatment of boomers in terms of as donors and millennials, and of course there's always the folks in the middle, the X generation, but in which each of these generations, largely speaking, require different kinds of engagement. We are still finding that the ages 60 plus still prefer direct marketing, and even as they use online, if they received something in the mail and it's online at the same time, that'll clinch the deal. In the case of millennials, forget about direct marketing. So I think that as one's building up for the future, it will be people will be in peril if they don't do it, even if it doesn't yield the results that they're hoping for yet. It may down the road.
And this is Steve Churchill. Online giving is not a big piece of the dollars that are received from healthcare institutions, but and my members are development professionals at hospitals and at hospices and long-term care providers. But I think when you look at the overall health sector, online giving has been huge. And we've talked about crowdfunding, but certainly disease-specific organizations have really succeeded through crowdfunding. The Ice Bucket Challenge obviously is one example, but often disease-specific organizations really have a compelling case for support, and often there's a sense for urgency. So I see many in the healthcare sector benefiting, not as much in terms of healthcare philanthropy for hospitals, but it is something that's growing in terms of starting with fundraising and building from there. I do think there are some things that are pretty obvious you can do for best practices. One is just making sure that your Facebook is mobile compatible. And that may seem pretty obvious, but when you look at the generations that are coming into it, more people are accessing information through their portable mobile device than they are through the website. And the other, I think, is for hospitals focusing on tribute giving to honor individuals, and also just recognizing that about 30% of online gifts come during the month of December, and having a strategy that focuses on that is important. And obviously, publishing an e-newsletter is really important to engage people in the mission of your organization.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. I'm going to turn to a couple of the questions that we've received from our audience and start, Sue, with a question for you from Carol Thielen. Carol is wondering if it's possible to break down the total giving to education by endowment versus capital versus annual fund. Do you have any read on that?
Whilst I'm looking into that figure, I just wanted to, and it's a really great question. The thing that I wanted to reference that I don't think we've covered it all yet, and I just really thought it was an important area to flag in this conversation in terms of looking at where our donors are coming from. One of the key issues that Case has been looking at in recent years, and there's been a growing focus on this, is looking at the diversity of the donor base, which, as we all, I think, we're aware in terms of donations in the US, is an area that is really growing. But therefore, looking at the diversity of people working in our advancement offices and thinking about ensuring that we increase that and increase focus on that in terms of it effectively and efficiently reflecting the societal makeup. I think we're really focused on that with PACE. We launched earlier this week an internship program with 46 interns joining various institutions across the USA and Canada with a real focus upon that. Going back to the question you asked, looking at the data, which I think is drawn from the VSE survey from CAE, we're seeing that 60% of gifts through philanthropic support in education is for current purposes, and 40% is for capital purposes, and 37% is going into endowment. Of the 40%.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. Very helpful. Here's an interesting question from Mike Bates, and this refers back to the Bloomberg example that was given earlier. How do we teach board and executive leadership that the Bloomberg story was not an overnight success? Any words of wisdom for our audience on how to bring these kinds of examples into their board and leadership conversations?
You know, having just concluded a board meeting half an hour before this call began, one of the things we talked about in our board was short-term responsibility versus long-term, and the anxiety in boardrooms to make sure that we meet our goals for the coming fiscal year and that the plans for the next fiscal year are shaping up and that each are growing proportionately makes it very hard for them to think about the long term, particularly if board members, as in a good, well-governed organization, have limited terms of maybe 4 years, 6 years, 8 years, or 10 years, or something like that. And I think that one of the ways to help with that is to have retreats with boards from time to time, once a year or once every 2 years, in which there is an opportunity in that board to have long-term thinking. I also think that organizations that have 10-year goals or long-term goals and then have strategies against those goals may find board members more sympathetic to investing in the long term to reach those 10-year platforms than if the goal is only for the next year or two. Just a couple of thoughts.
This is Steve Churchill. You know, I think it really comes down to board education, and including board education for each board meeting I think is really important, specifically focusing on their role and giving and whatnot. Board meetings can be so busy that there's not a focus on board member education. I think that's really critical. And the second is, you know, we just finished one of our conferences for the Association for Healthcare Philanthropy. More and more organizations are bringing their board members to conferences because they want to be speaking the same language. And they find that when they bring their board members to conferences like CASE or AHP or AFP, then they're starting to talk the same language and they're starting to understand the pressures. And so educating them at your board meetings and bringing them or sending them to conferences to help them to see the big picture, I think, is absolutely critical.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thanks, everyone. Unfortunately, we've reached the end of our time, and I just would like to extend my gratitude to the panelists for providing us with some incredible examples, lessons learned, and words of wisdom that we can take out of the conversation today and carry alongside the data from the Giving USA report. So let me turn it over to Peter for some final thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, and thanks to all of our panelists. It was really just a wonderful discussion. I'd like to say that I learned some valuable information during the dialogue. We want to thank everybody for participating. Just want to remind you that if you wish, you can download a complimentary executive summary of Giving USA 2016 by going to the website. By participating in this webinar, you also are eligible for a 30% discount on any of the Giving USA products, and there's an array of products that you may purchase. And just remember that your purchase, we hope, will be valuable to you and to your organization, and it will support next year's research. So with that, on behalf of my colleagues at Campbell & Company, I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank my colleague Kate for moderating the discussion in such a terrific way, and thank all of you for participating. Onward. Thank you very much.